Let's jump right into this explainer and unpack how Miguel de Cervantes constructed the ultimate anatomy of a delusion. We're talking about Don Quixote. This is a story that has literally shaped the foundation of modern storytelling for over 4 centuries. But to truly appreciate the genius of this work, we've got to look closely at how Cervantes meticulously builds a world where reality and imagination violently and hilariously collide. So how did a book written by a man in a miserable prison cell become the funniest, most enduring satire in literary history? It's a wild thought, right? Cervantes actually notes in his own preface that this story was begotten in a prison, a place where, as he puts it, every misery is lodged. Yet out of that totally dark, sterile environment, he managed to produce something incredibly vibrant. He perfectly dismantles the popular chivalric romances of 17th century Spain, creating this dry, shriveled, whimsical protagonist who just completely upends the world around him. As you probably know, the story follows an iconic trio: Don Quixote, his squire Sancho Panza, and his weary steed Rocinante. Our hero is a nearly 50-year-old country gentleman, spare, gaunt-featured, hardy. The source text tells us he basically abandoned his estate and his hunting because he stayed up from sunset to sunrise just poring over books of chivalry. The result? Well, his brain quite literally dried up from reading way too much fantasy, and he lost his wits entirely. Okay, so let's move into our first core theme: satirizing the chivalric romance. To really get the joke here, we have to look at the author's explicitly stated intent. Cervantes wasn't just writing a quirky adventure. He was writing a deliberate takedown of a genre that had absolutely obsessed his society. As a friend advises the author in the preface, the whole goal is to keep your aim fixed on the destruction of that ill-founded edifice of the books of chivalry. He wants to expose the sheer absurdity of these popular stories where knights slay impossible giants and magic magically solves every single problem. And to do this, he directly mocks the insanely convoluted language of those popular authors. I mean, just listen to this absurdity. The reason of the unreason with which my reason is afflicted so weakens my reason, that with reason I murmur at your beauty. Wow, that is exactly the kind of twisted, nonsensical prose that drives our poor hero mad. The text mentions he would lie awake striving to worm the meaning out of conceits that Aristotle himself couldn't have deciphered. Just a brilliant parody. Which brings us to the next phase: the making of Don Quixote. Let's look at Chapter 1, where our gentleman, originally named Alonso Quixano, actively constructs this delusional identity. Because, you don't just wake up a knight. He goes through a methodical, 4-step transformation before ever leaving his house. Step 1, he cleans up his great-grandfather's mildewed, rusty armor, slapping on a pasteboard helmet. Step 2, he spends 4 days renaming his incredibly bony horse Rocinante. Step 3, 8 more days christening himself Don Quixote of La Mancha. And finally, Step 4. Because a knight without a lady is like a body without a soul, right? So he invents his lady, Dulcinea del Toboso, completely rebranding a local farm girl who literally doesn't even know he exists.
With the rebrand complete, he sets out. Let's dig into reality versus knightly delusions.
The absolute core of this explainer relies on the tragic comic clashes between objective reality and Quixote's subjective imagination. On his first sally out, he's dead tired, he's hungry, and he desperately needs an adventure. So his mind just conjures one. Reality presents a dusty roadside inn in the Spanish countryside, but his delusion? Oh, he sees a shining castle with 4 turrets, silver pinnacles, a drawbridge, and a moat. He even sits on his horse outside, fully expecting a dwarf to blow a trumpet to announce his arrival.
And who does he meet at this so-called castle? In reality, it's just 2 working-class girls and a swineherd blowing a horn to round up his pigs. But Quixote's delusion immediately maps this onto fair maidens and the expected dwarf trumpeter. This perfectly captures the comedic gap of the whole story. He greets these terrified bystanders with absurd, archaic courtesy, lifting his clumsy pasteboard visor. And the women, well, naturally, they just burst out laughing at his completely incomprehensible language. The comedy really peaks when Quixote realizes he hasn't officially been dubbed a knight yet. So he corners the innkeeper and begs for the boon of knighthood. Now, the innkeeper realizes his guest is mad and decides to just play along for sport. In reality, he uses a straw and barley account book. But to Quixote, this is a sacred book used in a solemn knight-dubbing ceremony. The innkeeper reads from it like a devout prayer, smacks Quixote on the neck and shoulder, and Quixote remains entirely oblivious, totally fulfilled by this sham ceremony. But here's the thing. These delusions have real consequences. Shortly after leaving the inn, Quixote encounters a reality check, a farmer viciously beating a young servant boy named Andres. Quixote's delusion paints this as a ruthless oppressor whom he must heroically stop. He forces the farmer to swear an oath by the orders of knighthood to pay the boy and then rides off, feeling immensely proud. But the horrific reality? The second our knight rides away, the farmer ties the boy back up and beats him nearly to death. Quixote's heroic intervention actually made reality so much worse.
Next up in the explainer, the Great Book Purge. So after Quixote gets brutally beaten by a muleteer and dragged home by a neighbor, objective reality stages an intervention. While Quixote sleeps off his injuries, his friends, the village curate and the barber, conduct a hilarious literary scrutiny of his library. They act as literary critics, condemning bad books like Aspandian and Amadis of Greece to a massive bonfire out the window. But they do save a select few, like Amadis of Gaul, which proves Cervantes isn't just hating on literature as a whole, he's actively critiquing poor craftsmanship.
But just burning the books isn't enough. They have to explain where they went. The intervention escalates. His family literally walls up the library door under plaster. When he wakes up, they tell him a magical sage named Friston came on a cloud and stole the entire room. But get this, it backfires spectacularly. Blaming a magical sage only validates his worldview. It feeds his fantasy of being persecuted by enchanters and completely fuels his desire to get back out there.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Sancho and the windmills. Doubling down on his madness for a second sally, Quixote decides to bring a dose of grounded reality along for the ride. Enter Sancho Panza. Quixote recruits his poor neighbor, cleverly leveraging Sancho's own simple ambition against his grand delusions. He promises this honest, somewhat dim-witted farm laborer the governorship of an island in exchange for serving as his squire. And Sancho literally leaves his family, packs his saddlebags, and follows a madman onto the plains, all for the promise of a fantasy.
And that brings us to the most famous clash of all, in Chapter 8. They come across 30 or 40 windmills on a plain. In Quixote's delusion, these are monstrous giants with massive arms that he must slay. Sancho, representing grounded reality, tries to warn him. He plainly says, "Hey, what we see there are not giants, but windmills." But Sancho's warnings completely fall on deaf ears.
Ignoring reality entirely, Quixote yells his battle cry, "Though ye flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, ye have to reckon with me." He bravely charges at the windmills, shouting at them not to fly. As the wind picks up and the massive sails turn, Quixote is ultimately battling the very landscape of Spain itself. He forces his imagination onto the physical world, totally refusing to let something as mundane as a grain mill get in the way of his epic narrative.
So what does this all mean? It leaves us with a profound takeaway. Is there a little bit of Don Quixote's world-altering delusion in all of us? What starts as a hilarious parody of bad literature really evolves into a brilliant psychological study. This masterpiece leaves us wondering if we too sometimes try to force reality to fit the stories we desperately want to believe. Do we ignore the windmills in our own lives, preferring the romance of the giants? It's a question that makes this 17th century text feel incredibly modern, and it perfectly explains why Don Quixote continues to capture our imaginations today.